9 podcasts.
When is a Volkswagen Amarok as good as a Ford Ranger? Maybe even a little bit better than a Ford Ranger. In fact, when it is a Ford Ranger. This is the Drive Podcast. You're listening to the Drive Podcast. Trent and James Ward with you again, as we haven't done for a little while. Wardy, you're in Melbourne, I'm in Sydney. A special event, really, when you and I are on the podcast together, mainly for you and I, not for anybody else who's listening. And we are doing this because, which we'll get to later in the podcast, this is the last one for this block. And then, as our boss at work told me, he's quite funny. He said, what was the word? We get time off for good behaviour, I think was what he said, quote unquote. Thank you for joining me, mate.
Well, thank you, Trent. It's lovely to be here. And I was going to say what we shouldn't really make a point of, the appearance fee for just having both of us on the same podcast at the same time. Like someone's agents are just rubbing their hands.
The truth is we're only here because nobody else wants us anywhere else. So we just turned up here and on the podcast.
Let's not spoil the moment with some reality.
As we always do, mate, before we get into the news of the week, and we've picked a few good things to talk about. There's some exciting stuff this podcast. Before we get into that, what did you drive into the studio? Because I'm always excited to know, because when I'm in another state, I don't actually know.
Yeah, no, look, it is a bit of a surprise. So it is I'll give you a few hints. It is a major vehicle segment, the most major vehicle segment.
Okay.
So it is a medium-sized SUV. It is in a red kind of-y colour, but it's not the red kind of-y colour that you're probably thinking of. And it did win our Drive Car of the Year 2023 Best Medium-Sized SUV. It is, drumroll, Nissan X-Trail. It is the STL, so that's one up from base. It means you get some stuff, but not all the stuff. But what you do get is all the safety stuff. I've been driving it around town, and I've done quite a few kind of longer runs. So this weekend I was up in Mansfield and back, so I got to use obviously all of the cruise control and the lane keep, which beeps at you incessantly all the time. The steering one, when you change lanes, it lets you know when it's got a lane. So when its eyes can go, yep, cool, we're cool. I understand where the lane is. I'm in the center of the lane. A little steering wheel lights up, but it gives you a bloop bloop. Yeah. And so when you change lanes, it lets you know, oh, yep, cool, found my lane again. Then you change lanes, to overtake, and yep, got that lane. The beeps and beeps and beeps and beeps, they're pretty prevalent, but it does work quite well. And the thing that impressed me, I guess, the most is I went up at night on Saturday night, and so I got the adaptive high beam, and it's not the Matrix kind of super intelligent high beam stuff that I've had in the Volvo and in the Merc, which I must say, for any country driving in Australia, it is the game-changing piece of technology for you. Those super intelligent high beams, but just the adaptive in the X-Trail was great. Like, you go over a crest, it sees a car, it dips it back down. As soon as you pass, up it goes again. You don't need to think about it. It really does help. And you find just that as it gets really dark, the difference between your standard beams and your high beams are immense. And you really need it when driving around Australia. Yeah,
massive difference. I mean, it's real easy to get into parts of Australia in rural areas where there's just no light on the road at all. And you and I are fortunate, or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, to spend a lot of time driving in remote rural areas. Fortunate when you're not in an electric vehicle, unfortunate when you are, ask me how I know. And there's very often not a lot of light on the road. There just isn't. And when you drive, it's funny because the other thing that I'm fortunate or unfortunate enough to do is I drive a lot of shitty old cars by choice that I own, and you realise how bad lighting technology is.
The candles out the front.
Yeah, absolutely. You might as well put the flashlight on your phone and hold it out the window. It'd be better than the headlights.
Just going back to my drive on the weekend, what I really want to shout out to is anyone who listens to this who is from a regional area, because I left Melbourne at dusk. Going out through some of the outer suburbs, I reckon every second car either didn't have lights on.
Oh, it's how dopey, honestly.
I think the summary of the kind of driver here, I'm going to call you idiots. If you are running a car that has the capability of having automatic headlights and you go, no, I'm just going to run with my daylight running lights on at night, so I've got no rear lights on at all.
It's like numbskulls sitting next to you talking on their mobile phone in a brand new car that has Apple CarPlay or Bluetooth, and they're holding their phone to their ear.
I'm not going to be patient or understanding. They are idiots, those people. But I saw them around town. So people with no lights on, with just their running lights on. But as soon as I got out into proper countryside, approaching Yea and whatever, every car's doing the right thing. And it really does show you experience out on regional Australian roads. You basically become a better driver for it. You're so much more aware of your situation and the scenarios there. So a real shout out to anyone that headed up to Mansfield on the weekend or heading back. It was a bit of traffic.
I've got some breaking news for you on this podcast. People in the country are smarter than people in the city.
Mate, I would take that. And you know what? To an even probably more salient point, they make a better hamburger too. So stopping off at the fish and chip shop in Yea for dinner, a juicy burger with beetroot and pineapple, the only way that it really should be. Absolutely perfect.
That's disgusting. Absolutely disgusting.
Enough of that. What are you driving?
I drove into the studio today in the Jeep Grand Cherokee Overland 5-seater.
Oh, the 5-seater. Is it a shorter wheelbase?
I believe it is.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, it certainly looks like it is. I haven't actually looked at the specs because I'm not reviewing this car. I just stepped in it when someone else who's reviewing it, namely Sam Purcell, wasn't driving it. The issue that Jeep has with this vehicle, the way I see it, is it's $103,000 before on-road costs.
Yeah.
And if you look through the pricing and spec guide, a Toyota Land Cruiser 300 Series GXL is $104,000 before on-road costs. And as good as the Jeep is in terms of there's a lot in it, heated and cooled seats, leather trim, all of the gadgets and technology, the infotainment's good, Apple CarPlay works really well, lovely screens, good usability. The issue that Jeep has to, I guess, climb over in this country is why would you buy that vehicle in a large four-wheel drive segment when you're looking for capability, off-road ability, towing, long-distance touring, remote area servicing, access to parts, all that stuff. Jeep just can't compete with the likes of Toyota with the Land Cruiser, right?
I haven't driven the new Jeeps yet, and I know they've been Mazdaing their cars. They've been moving up market, and I think it's something that happens from time to time. You can see it; it really is quite a nice looking car. And I know Tom had one of the long wheelbase ones in Melbourne, and said it's comfy, it's really well featured. They are pushing into the preemie-ish space. If we remember where the Grand Cherokee was and that shape that has been around was around for about a decade, so popular, was a top 10 selling car at one point. Like it really was the car you would see everywhere because it was a lot of car for the money. I think they were, $70,000 for a nicely spec'd one.
Yeah. That's why they sold so many, right?
You got a lot of car. As soon as you move into that, and that 103,000, that's before on roads.
Correct.
So as soon as you move into that space where you are paying 110, 115, all of a sudden you are being compared to BMW X5s and Mercedes GLEs and Audi Q7s. And they may not have that, trail-rated appeal that the Jeep brand kind of carries. But I'd say somewhere between 90 and 99% of Jeep Grand Cherokees at that price point are not going off-road. So
no, fair point. You make a fair point, yeah.
It's going to be a challenge for them, and I think they do need to, like if it's a solid offering, they've got to really push the fact that you're getting a more upmarket car rather than just a newer Grand Checker. And I always liked those that previous gen car. They were, I think I once described it, it was a hamburger in the world of steaks. See, we're back talking about hamburgers. You've got the Europeans always trying to push a fancy filet, but the Americans are like, nah, man, burger is going to fill you up just as well. And I tell you what, it sort of worked a bit more simply that way. It may not have been as polished, but it was just a really good, solid all-rounder.
Absolutely. First news story of the week, and I think this is quite an important one. Peugeot does a number of things well. They design vehicles that are achingly beautiful to look at and always have been. As someone who's half Italian, I was going to say love-hate. I kind of have a hate-hate relationship with French cars. but one thing I will admit about Peugeots is they just look stunning. Funnily enough, and I don't want to go too far into this, some of the best looking French cars have, of course, been designed by Italians. Surprise, surprise. However, French cars do look stunning. This new 408 that we're about to talk about, we're calling it a sedan-styled SUV. What a stunning looking car, first of all.
Yeah.
And what I think is interesting, mate, it's going to come to Australia, but with plug-in hybrid power only. So there's not going to be a regular internal combustion engine specifically. There'll be plug-in hybrid power only.
Yeah, and I think this is, again, we're seeing this happen more and more. Established brands are saying, hey, look, we are making this transition to electric for other markets. So when we do in Australia, and let's face it, Peugeot deserves to do better than they do here. They've got an amazing...
They're great cars.
The cars are great.
Every time we test one, we say how good they are. They're fantastic things to drive. They're engaging, all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's it. I've owned many. I still own one that kind of is.
It's good
to
at the moment.
I tell you what, it's good that it's good to look at, because that's pretty much all you do with it for the most part. But their pricing at the moment is just a little bit wild. However, this new 408, for Peugeot to say, hey, look, we're doing this, we're going to only run with the plug-in hybrid version. It's part of this whole new energy push for these brands to make sure that they're kind of doing the right thing. But we don't know the pricing. It will be, we reckon it's going to start with a 7. It's not going to be cheap. None of the cars that they have at the moment are particularly cheap. But what they've got is an electrified option across the range. And I kind of like their kind of push for that. So I think it was last week we saw confirmation news that the E2008, so their smallest SUV, is coming here in a full electric. We know, and this is kind of the cool one, the E-Partner, so their little Volkswagen Caddy-sized van is coming here later this year as a full electric. And I love this idea. I think the whole kind of, even today we had a delivery come to the office. We're all getting deliveries to home. There's so many hub and spoke vehicles on the road where you've got a distribution centre and those cars are sent out to drop off your Amazon packages or your Woolly shopping or whatever it needs to be. When they're electric, that just makes so much sense because they're coming from a base, they're going out, they're doing a kind of a controlled loop. You're not doing that many K, so it doesn't need to be that big of a battery, or it means you can charge it back up really quickly. And you've got a nice, quiet, vibration-free environment for the driver. You've got that perfect kind of use of electric in the city. It's smart. But this one, it's cool. It looks cool. You're just not going to see too many on the road.
It is beautiful to look at.
Do you want to know what I like the most is they've launched it with a colour.
Rather than the German colours of the rainbow, silver, grey and white.
What would you call it? It's kind of the hero photos. If you check out the story on Drive.com.au, it's kind of it's a metallic aquamarine, and that new Peugeot grille and all the bits. It's a really funky looking car.
I'm trying to get some sort of assistance here in the studio as what we'd call the colour. Any feedback here? Aquamarine and electric blue.
But it's cool, right? It's a good-looking thing. So, look, again, that pricing thing is just something that we need to understand. And I know a similarly spec'd Volkswagen Golf, like you're paying basically 50 grand now for a Golf, for a high-spec car.
A lot less, right?
The milk creeps up and the bread creeps up, but when the Peugeots creep up, it's sort of like, it becomes a little less hard.
Absolutely. Now, moving along to talking about cars that regular people can afford and, cars that punters can understand and everyone can park one in their driveway. There's a car brand that's more valuable than 14 other car brands combined, right? So one car brand more valuable than 14 combined. No, it isn't Toyota. No, it isn't Ford. No, it isn't General Motors. It's a car of the people, Wardy. It's one that if I placed an order for myself, I'd order one for you as well because why not? Ferrari.
The people's brand.
The people's brand, that's right. Yeah, it's slugging it out with Lamborghini as the car that everyone can drive.
Do you know what though? I have a pair of Ferrari branded Puma sneakers somewhere in my cupboard, so I feel I'm part of the brand.
First of all, you're an idiot. And secondly, that is exactly why the brand is worth as much money that it is. Because according to a report from Automotive News Europe, go to drive.com.au, obviously, if you want to read this whole story. Ferrari has overtaken its own parent company, Stellantis, which is 14 brands. Alfa Romeo, Citroën, Fiat, Jeep, Peugeot, Ram, Vauxhall included among them, despite building less than 14,000 vehicles total in 2022. So Ferrari builds less than 14,000 vehicles total. They're worth more than their parent company. I tell you what, they're building a lot more than 14,000 pairs of, those stupid Puma sneakers that you've got in your closet, and that's why they're worth so much money.
They're kind of cool though. Except, they're quite good. But no, look, I hear you, and I think, look, it's this thing though. and I'm not gonna pretend to understand all of this, because we saw a lot of chit chat around value of car company last year when Tesla sort of came out and said we're worth $11 billion, more than every other car company in the world. And you'd think, oh, geez, I don't know. You've got two cars, and Toyota has a lot more and a lot more legacy. How are these valuations created? And look, we know that it's it's the market cap. So basically, how many shares are currently in market, and what's the current value of those shares? You multiply it out. There's your market cap. That's how much your company's worth. But I still find that whole world just a little confusing, because these are the same people that brought you Ponzi schemes and NFTs and all sorts of fun imaginary ways to pretend that you have money when you don't. I listen, I look at the numbers and go, yeah, well, it kind of checks out. And you're exactly correct. Ferrari are doing basically, they sell everything they make. They've got high profit margin on them. The Puro Sangue is obviously a cash cow for them, because they're able to produce more of those into markets where they can command a premium. And then you've got your options and things on top of them. Like, I'm going to give you a little tip here. When you tick the box and say, I want Apple CarPlay in my Ferrari.
Tell me how much it costs, Woody.
$7,000 as an option. Well, at least it did on the 488 or the F8 or one of those.
It is standard on a Kia Picanto, which starts from $19,990.
Yeah, well, that's because the rest of the Kia Picantos only costs $12,000 to make. So that's fair enough.
That's right. Yeah,
but yeah,
enough,
we joke. I'll give you a tip. It doesn't cost $7,000 to put that in the car. If you want the shields on the fenders, I think they're like a $2,000 option.
Yeah. And you have to have them, because if people are side on,
they're not going to know it's a Ferrari. So this is the thing. They're very profitable. They're obviously making money out of where they can. They're doing particularly well. As the growth of some markets, I think they're selling. I remember seeing some numbers. I think the US is still their biggest market. I think Europe and China are right up there. Mid-East is growing. So you've got a lot of spendy markets that are there and quite happy for the cars. But when you license your brand and you stick it on Puma sneakers and caps and backpacks and T-shirts and fragrances, that adds a lot more value.
Ferrari fragrance, that's right. Look, I think it's worth making the point. I wish that Ferrari and Lambo just built supercars. I wish that Porsche only built the 911 and maybe versions of the Cayman or the Boxster. But the reality is, for those of us like you and I that love what they actually started doing, this other nonsense, all this peripheral stuff, allows them to keep doing what they're doing. So if you want to hate on the fact that Porsche builds SUVs, the fact that the Cayenne and the Macan exist is the only reason that you still have a 911, right? So it's that simple.
And that's it. The way you look at what Ferrari's doing, I think the last bit of news we saw from Ferrari is the limited sort of the what do you call it? It's the Trofeo version, the super sporty version of the SF90 is coming.
That's right.
And the money that you need to be able to develop that car comes from selling sneakers to idiots like me. And that's pretty much how it all works. You want to do the cool stuff, you've got to go and pay the piper, and I've got to go and buy a pair of sneakers that sit in the back of my cupboard that I've worn once. And I'm sure there's plenty more people like me who have plenty more pairs of sneakers. I reckon you've got a pair somewhere, Trent.
You know what? Because this is going to show how stupid my brain is and how stupid I am. I needed a pair of like tiny sort of tight driving type shoes to drive these silly cars, right?
I'm glad you said shoes.
Yeah. Because you can't fit your feet into the tunnel, right? With a lot of them, you can't wear. If you got big feet, you can't wear regular sneakers.
Just to stop you there, I just want to interject. This is a first world problem. When you've forgotten to add the part,
so?
When driving your Ferrari, it's really hard to fit your big feet,
your big fat feet
into
that's right. Yep.
where the pedals
exactly
are.
Right.
Like that's the thing.
That's right.
It's a real stress for most of us.
It's difficult, but because I refused to bring myself to buy a pair of Ferrari branded sneakers, the only thing I could find that was small enough to do the job, I'm taking a deep breath here and making my confession, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned, were some Ducati branded sneakers, which is owned by Volkswagen, which is part of Lamborghini anyway. So I've just sent my money somewhere else.
Idiot.
Yeah, exactly.
What's even dumber is if you wear them on a Ducati, you might as well just chop your feet off.
Yeah, well, that's it. You can't wear them when you're on the bike. That's right. So what we've established here is we're both idiots. That's where we're at.
Well,
the end of this.
well, maybe here's the thing, right? What I would like to know now. Here's something. It kind of horrifies me, but interests me at the same time. If you've got a company like Tesla that does have a very high market cap for what they do, imagine when Tesla starts selling sneakers, because there's a whole bunch of people who are kind of idiots who'll go out there and buy them.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back from the break, we're going to talk to a very important guest that we've got on the podcast this week. Pretty exciting stuff, interesting stuff as well. Going to talk about some significant cars for Australia, the country in which we live. We'll be back straight after the break. Welcome back to the Drive podcast. Trent Nikolic and James Ward with you. Wardy, we get asked a lot about cars related to Australia. I was having a rant this morning in the form of a opinion piece that'll run on the website soon about badge engineering and platform sharing, and why don't we do it anymore and remember these cars. And we were talking about in the office earlier today when Holden dared to bring in a European-built vehicle that they badged a Commodore and what happened there. And there's so much interesting history in terms of the motor car in Australia, in a big country that was very hard to navigate before the motor car, right?
Yeah, and that culture of Australian cars, and actually it's a little kind of fun segue. We would have seen it this week. Basically the example of how important cars are to the Australian id was Eurovision, the Australian entry, which still cracks me up that Australia enters into Eurovision.
Australia's part of
that's
Europe,
another story.
I've had some Americans tell me before over there that Australia's part of Europe, so maybe it is.
Yeah, well, they're the best people to ask for geographic questions, so that's always a tip.
They know a lot about it.
But yeah, the Perth band Voyager, who was Australia's entrant into Eurovision, came on stage with an AW11 MR2. And the backstory, Susan's put a thing together. Basically, he owned the car in Australia. It's his own car, absolutely loves it, and he's now made it part of his act. And I think we worked out before the show last year, Eurovision had 161 million people watching it. And so the AW11 Toyota MR2 is now, well up in the awareness phase. And even though it's not an Australian-built car or anything like that, it's a part of their car culture. And again, last week, Rob wrote a story about the Ford Cortina, that when we took our usual approach of adding power makes things better in the Australian way, actually did the opposite. We took the 4-cylinder Cortina, stuck a 6-cylinder in it and made it terrible. We had a heap of comments. I think there's over 60 comments of people telling their Cortina stories. People engage. People want to, those interesting backstories, those little sort of side segues, those things that you learn that you didn't really know about the Australian car scene, regardless. And it doesn't have to be, Kingswoods and Commodores. There's so many fascinating stories to be told.
So to tell us more about the culture of cars in Australia, and the stories run deep, everybody that we speak to in this country has a story about a car, where they started driving. Part of the 9 family of podcasts is a new podcast that's been on for a little while now called Cars That Made Australia. The host of that podcast is Tim Rosso Ross. Everybody knows who he is, and he's been telling some amazing stories. So this week he joins us on the Drive podcast.
From Kings of the Mountain,
HSV, Clubby,
Gerada, SLR 5000,
to the chariots of our city streets,
Brown, Valiant Charger,
family favourites and suburban heroes.
Mitsubishi Magna, which I call Mori.
I grew up in a fibro house. People drove Datsuns.
And even a few heroic failures.
I think only really somebody with quite a macabre sense of humour can truly appreciate the Capri.
When I got my boat licence, I said, what's it like getting a boat licence? It's like driving a Leyland P76.
This is the story of the people who drove them and the people who rode in them. This is the story of the cars that made Australia.
Tim, thanks for joining us, mate. Cars That Made Australia. I must confess, I loved the idea of this podcast when it was first mentioned. Tell listeners first up a little bit about the cars that made you, maybe, and why you are a car guy. Because I reckon there'd be plenty of people who don't know that you love cars as much as you do.
Yeah, I don't have the same. No one's ever going to accuse me of being a rev head, but I like the social history side of stuff, and I like the design element of cars, and I love how they just was such a huge part of my life growing up. It's all those formative moments. I loved when Mum came home with the green Kingswood in 1976. And
how Aussie is that line that you just delivered?
It was incredibly exciting. And I remember one of my earliest memories of a holiday, we were going from Melbourne to Adelaide. And you remember how at the back of the car behind the petrol tank was behind the number plate?
Correct. Yeah, that's right. Yep.
And we stopped at a service station. We had this brand new car, and I was like, I wonder if the guy will know where to put the petrol. And I was like, how did he know? How did he know?
How did he work that out?
Then in 1977 was the first time I went in a Statesman, and we had these friends around the corner, and he worked for Holden, so they always had new cars all the time.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
And he came to pick us up to go and see Star Wars. And it was the first time I touched electric windows. And I remember that vividly.
Ah, yes. Take it for granted now.
And then I suppose the real fun was when I was a teenager and we all started to drive, and mates had a mate who had a Chimera, and then, another one had a V8 Ford XC. And, he just drive. It was maroon, and we just drive around. He just pick you up. I'm going to Vic Roads. Do you want to come for the drive? And of course, when you're that age, you go anywhere.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that sounds like fun.
That'd be fun.
And we might get some Red Rooster afterwards. And then I had a Datsun 260C that I just loved.
I've had one of them. Yeah, I've had one of them.
It was a great car. And then I rode off I had a girlfriend. I rode off a 180B. Which, and I'll never forget. It was the best line. And it was her pride and joy. It was the only thing her dad ever bought her, and it meant so much to her. And then I was doing this crappy play in Lygon Street in Carlton, and then I pulled out in front of a taxi or something. And then the tow truck driver said to me, I was like, "Oh mate, do you reckon I'll get anything from the wreckers?" And he said, "Mate." Yeah, and I had a beret on or something like that. I was doing student theatre, and he just looked me up and down. He said, "Mate, no one wants the arse end of a 180B, mate." And that was sort of it. So those sorts of things happen, and then you realise I did Paul Clark's beautiful show Wide Open Road for the ABC.
Yeah, great show. That was excellent. That show, loved it.
Yeah. And I just realised that how things can connect us, and so bizarre. About 6 months after that, when I was working at the radio, and there was the launch of The Voice or something. They had this, and all the judges there, and I was going along to that, and out of nowhere, Keith Urban and Nicole turn up, and Keith just makes a beeline for me. He just bolts towards me, and it was so weird.
He's big on cars, mate. Keith is big on cars.
And he said, "Oh, I've just been on the plane and I saw Wide Open Road. I love that show. I just wanted to let you know." And I went, "Mate, I didn't have much to do with it, but I'll take it for it." But those sorts of, and he, like so many people, and from doing this podcast, I get there's 1 million people who are sending in their messages and emails and stories about their connections with cars now and in the past as well.
Cars are very much part of the fabric of Australian culture, the way the cities and the towns develop, the roads between them, the road trips that we go on, the places that you stop, the places that you visit, right? It's so part of our DNA.
Yeah, very much so, and it's the same reason the motels took off in the way that they did in America.
Exactly.
And we turned into the for a period of time in the 1950s, turned into the people of the suburbs. So it only stands to reason that cars mean a great deal for us. And also, I always think about them as a way of getting out of the suburbs,
sure,
and into the city. And that's what I wasn't crazy about the isolation of the suburbs when I was a kid. So as a teenager, and so when we could get in the car and just get out of the burbs, and they really are freedom on four wheels. And getting on the train is great. Getting on a tram was great when I grew up in Melbourne. But there was something about the cocoon of what happens when you get in a car that's really, really special, I think, in terms of friendships and conversations.
Is that something that still appeals to you the same way now as an adult? Like if you and I are probably similar vintage, and cars are very much that symbol of your freedom, obviously, when you get to license age, that it's your way of getting around, as you said, getting out of the suburbs. But do you still have that same attraction to it now? Do you look at a car, you think about a road trip, you get in it and you go on that road trip and you go exploring? Is that something that's grown as you've gotten older that you look at as well still?
Yeah, I think so. And I just having that opportunity to do that with my mates in the same way. I think that's the sadness of, the older you get and then life gets in the way and kids get in the way, that I'm lucky I work with my best mate and we tour a lot, and so we're always in the car or on a plane to have those sorts of conversations. But, I did a road trip, a mate of mine bought an old Porsche, funny old thing, and we drove it from Melbourne to Sydney, and it was the best, the fumes killed us the whole lot, and, we're still coughing from it. But that because everything stops, and they always say, if you want to get a kid to chat, put him in the car and just wait for him to talk.
Sure.
And I got this. Yeah. I had a beautiful email the other day from a woman who's driving around with her dad, who's sadly, at the end of his life, dying of cancer, and they were listening to the podcast and they were reminiscing about the car, and he hadn't been speaking much, and he listened to the podcast and suddenly had him talking about all of these cars that he'd had over the years and reminiscing about their Commodore. And I thought it was such a beautiful story. And I was so pleased that happened out of the podcast.
Have you noticed, to that point that you just made there, that when you bring a car into the equation, everybody's got a story. Everybody wants to talk. Everybody wants to reminisce about some way that car or something related to that car had an impact on them?
I mean, it's our one touchstone. It's the one thing that connects us. So I think, almost 95% of us probably had a first car, and even I always think even when they're terrible, even when they're pieces of shit, you're
maybe
still
especially when they're terrible. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and when you say goodbye to them, then you do get upset by it. And it's something I've been interested in for a long time, because you're always looking for stories that can unite us, that mean something to us, that tell a story about who we are. And I suppose from a media point of view, the conversation, everyone stops at the car stuff and they go, "Oh, it's too blokey," and it's that's,
I think
it's
quite
not
the
everyone.
contrary, isn't it?
And I agree to that. I think that there's a certain extent that it is for everyone. It's just how you package it, and that's why I suppose everyone's got a story and everyone reminisces, and I do wonder whether kids feel the same way about how their cars are, whether or not they have the same appeal as they used to. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's probably changing. I think that's one of the things that concerns me as we talk about this transition to electric, is that as good as some electric cars are, and some of them are amazing, but they can get to a point, and this is what the difficulty is for manufacturers, is how you inject personality into them. You talked about your mate with his old Porsche. If you drive a 70s Porsche, then you drive a 70s Ferrari, then you drive a 70s Lamborghini, then a 70s Falcon, then a 70s Holden, they're all different. They've got very, very different characteristics and different personalities, whereas electric cars can become appliances or white goods if the manufacturers aren't careful. And I think that character that you speak about is one of the reasons that as young people we were attracted to cars, and I hope that the next generation of drivers looks at them the way that we do, because it is symbolic of something bigger than just getting from A to B.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Because everything's going to be so much more driven by cost, and price will be the winner in this situation. And there'll be so. Every time you look around, you go, "What's that thing on the road?" It's driving around with a GHD with wheels. And I can't keep up with it, but you'd like to think that the next step is the more of them are on the road, the more personality comes into them, and then people start doing ridiculous things to them. Or you can buy a shell. People start making them themselves. They're that simple, aren't they?
That's right.
In some ways, you go. We still haven't seen that, where people start mucking around with them, turning them into chooks, or putting, I don't know what sort of weird things you could put on them, but or making them the way they make them make noise. That'll be the best one.
Yeah, the fake stuff. Yeah, exactly. It'll be funny to listen to. Is there anything that you've discovered during the course of this podcast, which is fantastic, and I urge everyone to have a listen to it, because I really do think that the stories that you're telling and the way in which you're telling them is obviously very engaging, but the stories that you're telling will resonate with so many people. Was there a story that you uncovered that you just went, oh, I wasn't aware of that at all, even as an enthusiast like you are for the backstory?
I think my favourite story was talking to Fred Skepsy about the Charger commercial.
Yeah.
Hey Charger with the big V, and how they were doing the ad and they got this actor, a handsome guy for the ad. He turns up and he can't drive. So that's a bit of a problem for a Charger commercial. So they've got him in the car. There's no time to replace him. So they got him in the car and he's pretending to drive, and the assistant director's basically, underneath the car, and driving it from the side. And then he goes to put up his fingers for to do the Hey Charger sign, and he's missing a finger. So it's in black and white, and so they had to make him a prosthetic finger. So the art department knocked him up a finger, and because it's in black and white, and you can't see it. Still to this day, there's a guy. So I think how that one's never come out, we've never heard it before. I don't know, but it's absolutely brilliant.
Surely. One last one, mate. Surely you've only scratched the surface, right? Like, a little bit self-serving for me because I've enjoyed listening to them, and I'd be happy for there to be 100 episodes of it. But surely you've only scratched the surface. There's going to be so many more stories to tell.
I mean, yeah, we're doing we've done a series without Falcon or the Monaro in it, and so it becomes trickier to some of those less popular vehicles in some ways, fleshing out the story but of those. And I think that's where the real challenge is going to be, going, well, can we find enough doctors and dentists and school teachers that are still alive who can tell us about when they had a Peugeot 504? He is hoping,
fingers crossed.
I think that's interesting, particularly those cars that they put together here, or people can look back, or the more recent cars. I think that's going to be fun too, where there's cars that were popular 10 years ago that have surely got a story to tell. So it's onwards and upwards.
Absolutely, mate. Look, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you taking some time to have a chat to us. Before you go, just tell everybody again what the podcast's called and where they can find it.
Cars That Made Australia, and you can get them, of course, as they say in the classics, wherever you get your podcasts.
Tim Ross, thanks for joining us, mate.
Good on you, buddy. Thanks for your support.
Mate, that was great. I've had a listen to a couple of Rosso's episodes, and even, do you know what I like about it? Even we learn something.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
We like to think that we're right up there with all of the backstories and all of the interesting things. But what you really kind of can't get anywhere else are those first-hand stories of the people involved. So, look, for all the listeners, once you've finished listening to, obviously, the Drive podcast that, of course, you subscribe to and listen to every week like clockwork.
Religiously.
Get Rosso on the subscription thing and listen to it next. It's a cracker.
I think the next podcast we should add to the Drive one is that you, me and Tim sit around and just talk for 6 hours about cars.
The Trent Nicklick experience, we really sort of doubled down on it.
Yeah, that's just what the world wants. Before we wrap up for this week, mate, and for this season, I guess, let's have a chat about a segment that, I don't know about you, Wardy, but I reckon Australians quite like, and I say this jokingly every time we mention them, dual cabs. I've
heard of them.
Yeah, have you seen one or two around?
Couple.
Yeah. So last week I had driven the Volkswagen Amarok, but last week, courtesy of the vagaries of the way our industry works, I wasn't able to tell anybody what I thought of the Volkswagen Amarok. But surprise, surprise, Volkswagen, who is platform sharing with Ford, has taken an already excellent dual cab and not made it worse. Look, I wrote in the review, and I think this is still the case, if you put them spec for spec next to each other, I reckon right now I buy the Amarok.
Yeah, look, I've driven it as well, and look, we know that the Ranger and the Amarok are, they share an awful lot of components, the engines, the drive lines, all that sort of bits and pieces. But outside, gee, I tell you what, VW has done a really good job of making it look like a VW. It's a good-looking truck. The old Amarok looked pretty tough. This one, it just looks good. We had the Panamericana, which I think is mid
Second
to
most
high range.
It
had the leather seats with the alligator print kind of thing on them, which look, that part of it could have been left behind. But it's a really good car. And let's be really clear. The Ford Ranger is the 2023 reigning drive car of the year. It is an excellent vehicle. It is relevant for Australia. It is the number one selling car in Australia. And Ford's approach to that car to make it a cohesive product, not just a better ute. It is a really, really refined, well thought out product. What the Amarok does to that for buyers is gives them a slightly more upmarket and slightly, less tradie one. It is very much now the SUV with a tub more than it ever has been. And I think, look, despite the fact that you do get a far more practical car out of an SUV, there are still a lot of families who are looking at a ute as being the solution as the family car. The ride, that smooth V6, the front seats are excellent. There's some really, really solid parts of that car that make it a very viable car for a lot of people to have as the main family car.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right on the styling. For me, it looks attractive, I reckon. I know that not a lot of dual cabs necessarily look attractive. They look a little bit more robust, I guess, and rugged in terms of the way the styling is done as a general rule. But I think the Amarok looks really good. I think it's priced right. The changes they've made, I think, make it, in inverted commas, Volkswagen enough to satisfy the VW fans, I think. But I think people need to understand when they do the whole, it's just Ford Ranger underneath, as you were joking about before, Volkswagen had limited success with this vehicle outside of Australia. It did sell in other markets, but not with the same success that it did in Australia. As such, Volkswagen Australia had a case to keep selling Amaroks in Australia, but the rest of the Volkswagen network around the world kind of went, well, we don't really need one in most large markets. Now, what that means is you'd be spending probably now billions of dollars to develop a platform that you're hardly going to sell in markets around the world outside of Australia. So the only way that an Amarok could exist in our market for people who want to buy one is if Volkswagen did exactly what they've done here, which is platform share. So I think the reality is that this is the reason you can still buy an Amarok in 2023. If it wasn't for the arrangement with the Ford Ranger, you wouldn't be able to buy one. It's just as simple as that.
But what you're finding is that you do, exactly as you say, Trent, you do feel like you're in a Volkswagen. The switchgear, the instrument cluster, they've got its own software on the infotainment screen. Even that center stack, which I'm going to say I actually prefer the Rangers because it's got real heating and cooling controls as opposed to the touchscreen controls in the Amarok. But it's different enough than to separate the cars, and it does feel like a Volkswagen. So for people who don't care what's underneath and go, well, I really just want the VW Ute because I've had the old Amarok, or I want to park a VW in the driveway, it's a really good option. And look, we have had a couple of comparisons, so we've got those publishing on the site over the next couple of weeks, so we can sort of share our thoughts with those. But there's definitely, I think, benefit for buyers to have another option in that part of the market that we know is growing, and we know that premium, high spec, everyday ute market is a really, really strong one. And I'd prefer to see more people in these than I would in, some of the, maybe even the European four-wheel drives and things like that, because at least you've actually got a more efficient car. You've kind of got a better use car for this sort of thing. It's an area of the market I don't think we're going to see slowing for a while, but where are we now? Ranger, Hilux, Model 3. Australia's just going for a really kind of crazy top 10, I think, before the end of the year. But yeah, Amarok, I was really impressed with. It's a really, really solid product.
I'll tell you a couple of things. So even, not only is the seat foam different in the Amarok, the density of the foam that they have used is different. So the seats feel different.
Great
to a Ranger.
seats.
Yeah, absolutely. And
yeah, they're really good seats.
Yeah, the seats that were in the old Amarok were one of the highlights of that vehicle. So for Volkswagen to prioritise that, I think that was important. Looking across the range, you got a single turbo diesel, 4-cylinder in the entry level. Then you got the twin turbo diesel, the 2-litre, the 3-litre turbo diesel V6. The engine for me that I think is a real dark horse is the 2.3-litre turbocharged petrol. Right, it's a 4-cylinder, makes 222 kilowatts, 452 newton meters, the same 10-speed automatic, 3.5-ton brake towing capacity, all the same specs. At the moment, it's only available, I think, if I'm right in this, it's in Aventura spec, but I suspect it'll be very, very popular with people who buy these largely just to roll around town and do the regular daily driving stuff and aren't doing long distance touring in them. And I also suspect if they're as popular as I think they might be, Volkswagen might look to add that to different spec levels across the range as well.
The benefit for people, sort of trying to work out, if you are doing long distances, diesels work out, and it is that relaxed touring capability of a diesel. That's where they are the most efficient. But around town, you end up with issues with the DPF. They're not building up enough heat within it, and you don't get that immediate kind of performance at low in the rev range like you do out of a petrol car. So the idea of having a petrol ute for a far more urban usage, which we know these things get done for, I think could work really, really well for VW.
Absolutely, mate. That brings us to the end of another podcast, but not just the end of a podcast, Wardy. We are getting a few weeks off, which is nice for you and I who've got
it's the end of the season.
Yeah.
Well, this is where in TV land, both of us run the risk of being replaced by a younger, more attractive version of ourselves to still come on with the same name. So, let's just hope that the writers of the Drive podcast don't suddenly go, oh, look, Trent hasn't renewed his contract. Let's replace him with Ashton Kutcher and we're straight in there. But what does it allow us more than anything? It allows you to take a break. I think you're going back to the motherland to go you're going to do a bit of work, but then, pizza and espresso in the...
Pizza and pasta, yeah, that's right. I'm driving, and I'll be able to tell you in a couple of weeks about what I'm driving over there, but it's Abarth and Fiat 500 electric, so it's electric versions of cult classic cars, which I think is really cool. And as always, everything that we've spoken about today, all of the information that we talk about on the podcast is available over at Drive.com.au, including all of our videos, the YouTube channel. You can go through to that or watch the videos on site. Wardy, thank you for joining me, mate.
No, thank you. And thank you, listeners. We always enjoy this. We get great feedback from the podcast. We're nice and high up in the channels. I think we will have to have a word to Rosso for not being so good at what he's doing, and maybe just sort of give us a little bit of a chance to reclaim our number one spot. But
I'll get the Tonya Harding 2000 out and just kneecap him on the way out. Yeah.
That's it. I think that's what we need. But now, as the traffic gets worse and your commute gets longer, you've now got 2 podcasts to listen to, and that's our gift to you.
Thank you, mate, for joining me. Don't forget to click on subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast so you can stay up to date. You can catch up on all the ones you might have missed before this one, and then we'll speak to you again. We'll see you again in another couple of weeks when we join you again for The Drive.